So what is discourse analysis as a methodology? So we're going to start with thinking about what Melissa Nisbet's article was about. So what was it that she was trying to do with this article? Well, she analysed 3 policy documents in particular. Obviously, other documents were analysed as well, including this Demos article on cultural diplomacy. But the main focus was DCMS's international strategy of 2006. And what were the main themes? She identified through thematic analysis, competition, collaboration, and contribution. Now, obviously, she's picked these 3 words because they sound quite similar. So to a degree, this is a kind of an invention of her own, you know, like these aren't necessarily the only ways that you could carve up the main themes. You might call them slightly different things that had slightly different values. But for Melissa, using her methodology in which meanings emerged through multiple readings, these were the 3 themes that she located. And within these themes, she found keywords were used repeatedly. So, as well as the thematic analysis, she identified keywords and how they are repeated using content analysis, as we've just discovered in the What is Discourse Analysis lecture. Now, of particular interest is this we, our, and partnerships. So for me, I found that particularly interesting because, as I mentioned in video 2, there are a number of ways that Norman Fairclough identifies how these words are used to assert particular cultural identities and ideas of power. Now, what's probably the most interesting, and I've referred to this in the other videos, is that the sub-theme in all 3 is Britain is best. So we have to remember that Melissa analysed these policy documents in 2012. It was published in 2013. These policy documents originate from 2005 and 6. And we are looking back from 2020 on these meanings. So both the meanings that emerged for Melissa at a particular moment in time, as well as the meanings used and instrumentalised by DCMS, the Arts Council, and the British Museum at a particular moment in time. So documents, they are not neutral, as Melissa tells us. They are not transparent reflections of any organisation or institution. In fact, they actively construct the institutions that they claim to describe. So go back to Foucault and think about how this is familiar in what he was saying to us. Also, they are written with a particular audience in mind and need to be approached for what they are used to accomplish. So, you know, when you're thinking about a policy document, you know, who's written it? When was it written? Who is it written for? Do they say that the document is written for one group of people when actually you can tell it's kind of written for someone else? And what is the institution? You know, often, for example, Arts Council England policy documents are written by a consultant who's been paid a certain amount of money to produce a policy document that arguably might want to argue, say, the value of the arts to health and well-being, as we're going to discover in the later extra tasks, should you wish to do them. So it's important to establish these aspects of context. Now, in Melissa's case, there was no information in the public realm on the background of the document she was analysing. But because these documents emerged in line with political priorities under the Labour government, she was able to kind of guess and establish some kind of context that meant that she was able to analyze them in a particular way. But there is not only no detail on their background, but no detail on the purpose of these policy documents. So, particular points of interest included why they had been written, who they were produced for, what their objectives were, and whether they were linked to cultural diplomacy. Also, how were these ideas being implemented? What is the real work that these documents are doing? Now, Melissa says this lack of context was the key reason for the choice of documents and their analysis. And you might remember Rosgill talking about vagueness when she talks about discourse analysis. And this is certainly something that I find in my discourse analysis work, is often I end up interrogating absence of information rather than established facts. It's often, you just have to think about all of the slippery politicians who, when asked a simple question, refuse to answer it directly, at least. Instead, they talk round and round in circles with a load of rubbish that doesn't necessarily mean anything to anyone, let alone answer the question. So it is in the absence of an answer that one knows that the politician has to lie in that particular moment. So you can use these kind of instincts with a policy document or with distinct small pieces of text. So what is thematic analysis? Now, this is this is a broader kind of analysis. So thematic analysis is used outside of discourse analysis. And you might find yourself, when it comes to doing your dissertation, for example, analysing transcripts from interviews that you've had with someone or something at a particular moment in time. It's quite likely that you will end up using thematic analysis. And you can use thematic analysis on images, you can use it on texts, whether they are interviews or whether they are policy documents. You can use thematic analysis across movies or anything. So when we talk about discourse, of course, it can be visual, it can be audio visual, and it can be textual. And they can all come from different domains and categories. So according to Gray, thematic analysis is a systematic technique extracted from grounded theory and located in social science. It emphasizes the importance of starting from a position informed by methodology and having clarity on what it is that is being analysed and why you are analysing it. So for Melissa, she was analysing these documents because of a lack of clarity of what they were. So it's a method of identifying the prominent themes in text and the prominent concepts, to look at how ideas can be broken down into separate themes, or indeed how they become interrelated. Through doing this, you can identify different patterns and relationships, which allows for a complex examination of their meaning in context. So Braun and Clark, which is the go-to academic article on how to do thematic analysis, Braun and Clark say that it is a method for identifying, analysing and reporting patterns, themes within data. It minimally organises and describes your data in rich detail. It frequently goes further and interprets various aspects of the research topic. So for Melissa, the analyses began with thorough and repeated readings of the documents. She approached the document one paragraph at a time. Keywords or phrases stood out to her through repetition. So through, Nisbet was able to identify areas of interest and repeated patterns of meaning, which she then made a note of. As the content became more familiar, words, lines, phrases, sentences, and paragraphs became coded through a process of color coding, classifying the data into specific categories. These codes are then abstracted, they're then honed and developed into themes through a series of cognitive mapping exercises. Now, this phrase was completed for Nisbet when all the conceptualized themes adequately and accurately reflected the text as far as she was concerned. So as you can see, this is a very subjective process, but through doing things over and over and over again, it can be extremely rigorous. Now, one thing actually that I should have pointed out is that there's a note in the footnote right on the first page of the article when Nisbet reflects on how this approach was on reflection rather naive. And what's important about discourse analysis is, and in fact most qualitative methods, is that you're not necessarily expecting to identify an ultimate truth. You acknowledge the subjectivity and the need for reflexivity of this particular method, and you include it. And you need to make sure you're able to describe the caveats and the limitations to your method. This is important for when you come to your dissertation. So through drawing attention to the lack of clarity in the terms, concepts and processes which surround policy, Nisbet suggests that such research naturally leads to fundamental questions such as what even is cultural policy? Nisbet claims that cultural policy scholars need to think about how we conceptualize cultural policy, how we study it empirically, and if we are not clear about what cultural policy is or indeed should be, then whether the documents actually reflect policy, an actual policy that actually exists, where they are located, and what purpose these documents are intended to serve. So these questions and the strategic use of documents that Nisbet was able to identify corroborate Hammond Hill's view of policy as an extremely slippery concept. So Nisbet's paper and my example show that policy documents are often elusive. They're difficult to grasp or to pin down and have an ulterior purpose. They bear little relationship to our formal expectations of policy. So if you go on to do the additional task using the examples that I've given of arts and health policy documents, you'll see how these documents don't necessarily actually reflect an actual policy that was actually happening at the actual time those documents were written. So because of the slippery nature of discourse and the fact that discourse analysis is not about uncovering an absolute truth, this means it's all in the interpretation, and it makes it a very flexible method, but also a very necessary method. But then I am going to say that because I'm a discourse analyst. So it will tend to highlight erasures or gaps, such as in Melissa's work, not finding an international policy document, and my work finding that the arts were not conducting open advocacy relating to well-being in their policy documents at the time of the Measuring National Wellbeing Programme. This is my this is my master's research, where I analysed Arts Council advocacy documents, arguing that in fact there was not enough advocacy for the relationship between the arts and wellbeing at the time that the Measuring National Wellbeing Programme was launched. And this is somewhat counterintuitive to the amount that we hear about the arts and health at other moments in time, including the newspaper article that you will be analysing from Peter Bazalgette. Now, one thing is when I do this as a live workshop and we do all these activities together, everyone gets really carried away with how fun it can be to have fun with the stupid things that important people say. But one thing that I must remind you is that you must remember that your own discourse analysis becomes a part of the discourse. So you have to be careful of your terms. So in the assignment, it's important to be critical without overly criticizing. And it's really easy to slip into the latter, especially for someone like me who's naturally critical. So this is a really hard balance. And, I just want to say that when it comes to the policy analysis task, have fun, but don't get too carried away, as Foucault might have you think.